October 8, 1882. The New York Central Railroad's private car, somewhere between Albany and New York City. A single sentence, 4 words spoken in a moment of brutal honesty, would transform the richest man in America into its most despised villain. The luxury railroad car cuts through the Hudson Valley like a palace in motion, its mahogany paneling gleaming in the amber glow of gas lamps that flicker with each curve of the track. Outside the frost-covered windows, autumn has begun its slow conquest, bleeding reds and golds into the cold air, while the rails hum beneath the weight of American ambition made manifest. Inside this rolling sanctuary, the world is smaller, darker, and infinitely more expensive. Heavy velvet curtains thick enough to smother sound hang along the windows, keeping out both the chill and the eyes of a world that William Henry Vanderbilt increasingly distrusts. The air is dense with cigar smoke that creates ghostly patterns in the lamplight, and beneath it all, the relentless rhythm of wheels against rails provides a hypnotic soundtrack to what will become one of the most infamous conversations in American financial history. At the center of this opulent fortress sits a man who, on paper, has no equal. William Henry Vanderbilt, master of the New York Central System, nominal sovereign of an empire that stretches from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, leans heavily behind an enormous desk bolted to the floor. His face is fleshy, tired, and carved with the deep grooves of a man older than his 61 years would suggest. His jowled features are flushed with the exhaustion that has become his permanent condition, shining with the unhealthy sheen of chronic insomnia. His waistcoat strains when he exhales, and his left hand trembles slightly, not from fear, but from the neurological exhaustion of managing an enterprise so vast it requires constant vigilance. In a cut glass ashtray, a cigar smolders unattended, leaving a long cylinder of ash that trembles with each subtle sway of the car, threatening to collapse under its own weight. On the desk before him, ledgers lie open beside sheaves of telegraphs, coal prices, freight tonnage, whispers of labor unrest, rumors from Wall Street. A man who controls more wealth than some nations cannot afford to let any detail escape his scrutiny. He possesses approximately $200 million, a sum so staggering that it exceeds the United States Treasury itself. He is an American sovereign, a king without a crown, whose steel rails thread through valleys like silver veins carrying the lifeblood of commerce. Across from him, perched on the edge of a plush seat, with the bearing of someone who knows he does not belong in such surroundings, sits a reporter from the Chicago Daily News. His suit is modest, nearly threadbare at the cuffs, but his notebook is new, pages pristine until this journey. The young man represents a new breed of American predator, the muckraker, armed not with weapons, but with persistence and ink. His fingers tighten around his pencil each time the car shudders, but his eyes never leave William's face. He has been granted something rare and dangerous, time alone with the richest man in America. For the past hour, their conversation has followed a predictable choreography. The reporter asks about railway expansion, about the marvel of connected cities, about the consolidation of Western lines. William responds in short, measured phrases, his answers as economical as his ledgers. Profits here. Efficiencies there. Consolidation. Competition. Capitalization. A man who rules an empire of movement speaks as if every word carries a cost that must be minimized. But beneath the rehearsed responses, fatigue is visible, almost physical. His voice carries the roughness of too many late meetings, too many 18-hour days managing the logistics of a continent. The reporter, emboldened by the monotony and sensing an opportunity, leans forward. His pencil hovers over the paper like a dagger poised to strike. He asks a question that appears, at first, to be merely philosophical, almost innocent in its phrasing. Do you run your trains for the benefit of the public? Time seems to suspend in the heavy air of the carriage. Outside, the landscape of America blurs past. Farms where families calculate their own survival by candlelight. factories where workers depend on Williams rails for their livelihoods, distant towns connected to the broader economy only by the steel threads he controls. Thousands of passengers ride his network at this very moment, ordinary Americans trusting their lives and fortunes to his system. They are the public. They are the customers. And in the eyes of the reporter, they are the masters whom William is supposed to serve. But there is a pause, not long, just enough for the world to pivot on its axis. William's eyes lift from the ledger he has been pretending to consult. For the first time, he truly looks at his visitor. Somewhere behind those heavy-lidded eyes, years of calculation collide with years of accumulated resentment. His life has become an endless ledger of credits and debits, success measured against scorn, competence weighed against contempt. The public, with its demands and accusations, has been a constant line item of irritation. They ride his trains, use his stations, profit from his infrastructure, and in return they accuse him of greed, question his methods, demand he operate as a charitable institution rather than a business. The question strikes an old nerve, hitting the fault line between exhausted honesty and practiced diplomacy. William Henry Vanderbilt is not a politician. He is not a diplomat. He is a man raised in the brutal shadow of his father, the Commodore, who taught him that emotions are liabilities and ledgers are the only truth. The day has been long, the years have been longer, and William does not excel at pretense. His reply comes not from malice, but from bone-deep fatigue and brutal candor. The public be damned. I'm working for my stockholders. The effect is instantaneous and devastating. The reporter's pencil stops moving mid-stroke. The scratching sound that has provided counterpoint to the train's rhythm suddenly ceases, creating a silence that feels heavier than the smoke hanging in the air. In that crystal moment, the only sound is the relentless clacking of wheels beneath them, beating time like a funeral drum. The young man's eyes widen, not with moral horror, but with professional recognition. 4 words: sharp, quotable, incendiary. They demand ink. They demand headlines. They are lightning captured in a bottle. William continues, encouraged by his own burst of honesty, explaining that he cannot be expected to sacrifice the financial health of the railroad to please a public that does not understand the mathematics of transportation. Railroads are not charities, he insists. They are businesses with stockholders who invested capital and deserve returns. His language is not poetic. It is precise, clinical, almost mathematical. Duty, capital, risk, words that make perfect sense on Wall Street and sound like betrayal everywhere else. He does not realize, perhaps cannot realize, that these distinctions will not survive the journey from private car to public page. Nuance does not travel as quickly as outrage. Context will be stripped away like bark from a tree. By morning, telegraph wires will carry his sentence across states and time zones with ruthless efficiency. Typesetters will lock the words into place. Printers will roll. Headlines will scream. The phrase "the public be damned" will stand alone, like a confession carved in stone, divorced from any explanation or qualification. The reaction will be immediate and nuclear. Within 24 hours, William Henry Vanderbilt will transform from a respected, albeit envied, businessman into a caricature of demonic greed. Editorial cartoonists will sharpen their pens, depicting him as a bloated robber baron, his enormous belly stuffed with gold coins, while skeletal workers are crushed beneath locomotive wheels. Preachers will thunder from pulpits about the moral rot that wealth breeds. Labor unions, already simmering with resentment, will find their rallying cry. Politicians seeking populist credentials will denounce him in speeches that echo from coast to coast. Letters will begin arriving at his Fifth Avenue mansion, hundreds, then thousands. They will not be fan mail. They will be death threats, detailed descriptions of planned kidnappings, promises to burn his depots and derail his trains. The public he damned will decide to damn him back with interest compounded by fury. His homes will require armed guards. His children will need escorts. The richest man in America will become a prisoner of his own wealth, surrounded by priceless art he has no time to appreciate, protected by men with guns against a nation that wants him dead. But here lies the crushing irony that transforms this moment from mere scandal into genuine tragedy. The caricature is fundamentally wrong. William Henry Vanderbilt is not a monster. He is not some idle aristocrat playing at business or a sociopathic predator feeding on public misery. In fact, he is arguably the most competent, diligent, and structurally brilliant industrialist of his generation, a man whose strategic mind surpasses even the legendary Commodore Vanderbilt. Consider the mathematical evidence that the newspapers will ignore in their rush to create a villain. When his father died in 1877, the Commodore left William an empire worth $95 million. The world expected the heir, once dismissed as a blatherskite and blockhead, to squander it spectacularly. They anticipated that the soft, asthmatic son would prove his father's harsh judgment correct, destroying the fortune through incompetence or frivolous spending. Instead, William accomplished the impossible. In just 8 years, through a period of intense economic volatility, he didn't merely maintain the fortune, he doubled it. He expanded the New York Central into a streamlined, terrifyingly efficient machine. He negotiated peace treaties between warring railroads. He standardized operations across thousands of miles of track. He stabilized the American economy during financial panics. He worked himself toward an early grave to prove that he was worthy of the name he bore, demonstrating a level of systematic brilliance that his father never possessed. The Commodore was a pirate. William was an architect. The Commodore ruled by force and intimidation. William ruled by strategy and precision. He was, by any objective measure, a superior businessman to his legendary father. Yet none of this competence will matter now. None of his innovations in railroad management, none of his careful stewardship of investor capital, none of his transformation of American commerce will shield him from the hatred those 4 words have unleashed. William Henry Vanderbilt is about to learn that in America, there are some things wealth cannot purchase: forgiveness, anonymity, or peace. The richest man in the world will spend his remaining years as a captive in his own mansion, working 18-hour days not from greed, but from the desperate need to prove his worth to a world that has already condemned him. He built a fortress of money to keep the world out, but the danger was already inside: his own resentment, his own exhaustion, and the terrible burden of trying to be something he fundamentally was not. As the train rattles on through the darkness toward New York City, William slumps back in his chair, lighting another cigar with hands that shake from more than fatigue. He has no idea that he has just committed social suicide. He believes he has simply stated an economic truth, won an argument with facts and logic. He is arguably the smartest man in American finance, yet he possesses a blind spot the size of the empire he controls. He does not understand that in the court of public opinion, truth is irrelevant, context is expendable, and a moment's honesty can eclipse a lifetime's achievement. History will not remember his competence. It will not remember the 18-hour days or the logistical miracles. It will not remember that he doubled the greatest fortune in American history through systematic brilliance. It will remember only the moment he lost his temper, only the 4 words that became his epitaph, etched into the collective memory of a nation that confused wealth with wickedness and competence with cruelty. But to understand how 4 words could destroy the most competent financier of his generation, we must journey back to a muddy farm on Staten Island, where a boy learned that being called worthless could become the most dangerous motivation of all. Before William Henry Vanderbilt became the richest man in America, he was nothing more than his father's greatest disappointment, exiled to a farm like a medieval prince banished from court. New York Harbor in 1821 was not merely a port, but a gladiatorial arena of commerce, a cauldron of ambition where fortunes were forged through violence, cunning, and an almost pathological refusal to acknowledge human limitation. Steam hissed from ferry boats cutting through gray water thick with industrial waste and the detritus of expanding trade, while seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries mixing with the shouts of dock workers and the groaning of rope against wood. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the brutal energy of early American capitalism, a place where weakness was not just discouraged but systematically eliminated. This was the kingdom of Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who embodied that savage energy with such intensity that even his allies feared him. The Commodore, as he insisted on being called, despite never having held legitimate naval rank, was a force of nature contained in human form. Standing 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5, he possessed the physical presence of someone accustomed to dominating every space he entered. His face was carved from granite, all sharp angles and cold calculation, with eyes that could reduce grown men to stammering children. He was functionally illiterate, having abandoned formal education at age 11 to work on his father's ferry, yet he possessed an almost supernatural gift for understanding leverage, timing, and the precise moment when another man's weakness could be exploited for maximum profit. Cornelius had clawed his way from nothing through a combination of strategic brilliance and sociopathic determination. He began with a single ferry boat purchased with a loan from his mother, operating between Staten Island and Manhattan. Within a decade, he controlled most of the harbor traffic through a campaign of price wars and intimidation that left competitors bankrupt or fleeing. Within 2 decades, he had expanded into steamship lines connecting New York to California during the gold rush, extracting obscene profits from desperate men willing to pay anything for passage. He hired and fired without sentiment, threatened competitors with ruin, and then delivered on those threats with methodical cruelty. By the time his first son was born, Cornelius Vanderbilt was already accumulating millions, and he had developed an unshakable conviction that wealth was the only measure of human worth. Into this world of masculine brutality and commercial warfare, William Henry Vanderbilt arrived on May 8, 1821, and immediately disappointed his father by existing. The boy was everything the Commodore despised: pale, sickly, prone to respiratory ailments that left him wheezing and weak. Where Cornelius was loud and physically imposing, William was quiet and bookish. Where the father was instinctive and aggressive, the son was analytical and contemplative. The Commodore looked at his firstborn and saw not an heir but a cosmic joke, nature's cruel commentary on the limits of paternal ambition. The contempt was not subtle or private. Cornelius referred to his son openly as a blatherskite, an old Dutch insult meaning someone who talks nonsense, a fool whose words carry no weight or meaning. In business meetings and family gatherings alike, he would mock William's soft hands, his interest in books, his complete lack of enthusiasm for the docks and deals that consumed his father's existence. The boy developed a stammer when speaking to his father, a physical manifestation of anxiety that only deepened Cornelius's disgust. The message was delivered with pathological consistency. William Henry Vanderbilt was unworthy of the name he carried, inadequate to inherit an empire built on ruthlessness and force. By the time William reached 19, the situation had become intolerable for both father and son. The young man showed no aptitude for his father's world of aggressive negotiation and intimidation. He preferred ledgers to confrontation, calculation to combat. Something had to be done. Cornelius Vanderbilt did not believe in coddling weakness, but neither could he entirely abandon his eldest son without social consequences. His solution was characteristically brutal and efficient, exile disguised as opportunity. In 1840, William Henry was dispatched to Staten Island with $50,000 and instructions to manage a failing farm the Commodore had acquired as part of a debt settlement. The property was marginal at best, 70 acres of rocky soil poorly suited for agriculture, isolated from the commercial energy of Manhattan, a backwater where ambition went to die. The terms were simple and devastating: make the farm profitable or accept permanent disinheritance. Prove yourself worthy of the Vanderbilt name or disappear from it entirely. The Commodore's expectation was transparently clear. He anticipated, perhaps even hoped, that his soft, asthmatic son would fail spectacularly within a year or two, providing final confirmation of William's fundamental inadequacy. The farm was designed to be a test that could not be passed, a mathematical proof of unworthiness. The old man could then proceed with a clear conscience to leave his fortune to someone more deserving, perhaps one of William's younger brothers, or simply to business partners who understood the religion of profit. But something unexpected happened in that sanctuary of exile. Away from his father's withering contempt, removed from the constant psychological assault of being measured and found wanting, William Henry Vanderbilt began to breathe, not just literally, though his asthma did improve in the cleaner air of Staten Island, but metaphorically. For the first time in his life, he existed in a space where his father's judgment could not reach him every hour of every day. The farm became not a prison, but a laboratory, a place where he could develop his own methods without constant comparison to the Commodore's brutal efficiency. William approached farming with the same methodical precision he had applied to his abandoned studies. He did not simply plant crops and hope for favorable weather. He studied agricultural economics, reading every treatise he could acquire on soil composition, crop rotation, and livestock breeding. He walked his 70 acres repeatedly, mapping drainage patterns, noting which sections received optimal sunlight, identifying areas where frost settled earliest in autumn. He kept detailed records of every expense and every yield, creating ledgers that would have impressed any accountant on Wall Street. More importantly, he learned patience. Agriculture operates on nature's timeline, not human ambitions. Seeds planted in spring do not yield profits until autumn, and even then, success depends on variables no amount of determination can control. This forced waiting, this acceptance of processes that cannot be rushed, taught William something his father never understood: that sustainable wealth is built through systems, not through force of personality. He began to see patterns where others saw accidents, to understand that small efficiencies compounded over time could produce results that matched or exceeded more dramatic interventions. In 1841, he married Maria Louisa Kissam, the daughter of a respected Brooklyn minister. She was not a society beauty or a strategic alliance designed to advance commercial interests. She was, instead, a woman of quiet intelligence and remarkable patience, qualities that would prove essential in managing both a farm and a husband perpetually haunted by his father's contempt. Together, they created something the Commodore's mansion in Manhattan conspicuously lacked: a genuine home. The farmhouse became filled with domestic rhythms entirely foreign to William's own childhood: regular meals, bedtime stories, the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms where business was never discussed. Maria Louisa would bear 8 children over the following years, and William proved to be a devoted, affectionate father, a deliberate correction of his own father's parenting style. This domestic stability provided the emotional ballast he needed to endure the long years of labor and the perpetual weight of proving himself worthy. Where his childhood had been defined by criticism and contempt, his family life became a refuge of acceptance and mutual support. The golden era of invisibility stretched across 18 years, from 1840 to 1864. While Cornelius Vanderbilt conquered railroads and accumulated millions through aggressive consolidation and ruthless competition, his exiled son quietly transformed a failing farm into a profitable enterprise. The 70 acres yielded increasing returns year after year. William negotiated contracts with Manhattan markets for his produce, established relationships with livestock traders, and gradually expanded his holdings by purchasing adjacent properties when they became available at favorable prices. His methods were antithetical to his father's approach. Where the Commodore bullied and intimidated, William negotiated and compromised. Where Cornelius made enemies as a matter of principle, William cultivated relationships based on mutual benefit. He paid his workers fairly and on time, which earned him loyalty and reduced turnover. He honored his contracts even when market conditions would have allowed him to renegotiate to his advantage, building a reputation for reliability that proved more valuable than short-term profits. The transformation was methodical and profound. William developed operational procedures for every aspect of farm management: planting schedules, maintenance routines, financial protocols. He understood that sustainable success required not just hard work, but intelligent organization, not just effort, but efficiency. Every decision was documented, every outcome analyzed, every mistake studied to prevent repetition. His ledgers became masterpieces of precision, tracking not just income and expenses, but patterns that revealed deeper truths about market timing and resource allocation. The farm's financial records tell a story that the Commodore never bothered to read during those 18 years. The initial $50,000 loan was repaid within 5 years. By year 10, the property was generating annual profits that exceeded what many Manhattan merchants earned. By year 15, William had accumulated enough capital to begin making his own investments in railroad stocks and bonds, quietly building a portfolio that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the transportation industry his father dominated. Yet all of this occurred in silence, beneath his father's notice and beyond his father's contempt. The Commodore, consumed with building a railroad empire that would eventually be worth $100 million, had essentially forgotten about his exiled son. Occasional reports reached him. The farm was not failing. William had married. Grandchildren were being born. But these facts registered as mere background noise in a life dominated by larger ambitions. As far as Cornelius was concerned, his eldest son had accepted his exile and was living out a quiet, irrelevant existence suitable for someone of limited capacity. This invisibility was, paradoxically, William Henry's greatest gift. Free from constant scrutiny and criticism, he developed confidence in his own methods. He learned that his approach, patient, systematic, focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term dominance, could produce results that matched or exceeded more aggressive strategies. He discovered that being underestimated was a form of protection, allowing him to work without interference or sabotage from those who might feel threatened by his competence. The boy who had been dismissed as a blatherskite was systematically developing into something far more dangerous than his father had ever been. A man who could think 3 moves ahead, who understood that true power came not from intimidation, but from indispensability, who had learned to calculate, not just in dollars, but in human psychology and market dynamics. He was becoming a master strategist, but one who operated through patience rather than aggression, through systems rather than personality. By 1864, the mathematical evidence of William's competence had become impossible to ignore. The farm was generating profits substantial enough that even the Commodore's accountants took notice. William Henry was 43 years old, the father of 8 children, and the manager of an enterprise that had succeeded despite, or perhaps because of, operating entirely outside his father's shadow. The old patriarch, now 70 years old and beginning to feel the weight of decades spent in ruthless competition, faced an uncomfortable reality. He needed a successor, and his most competent heir was the one he had spent a lifetime despising. The Civil War was raging, the world was changing at an unprecedented pace, and Cornelius Vanderbilt was wealthy beyond measure, but facing the one enemy he could not defeat: mortality. He looked around at his other children and saw a wasteland of disappointment. His younger sons were dissolute, epileptic, or dead. His daughters were, in his view, merely women unfit for business. The only viable candidate for succession was the exile across the harbor, the worthless son who had quietly built exactly the kind of systematic competence required to manage a railroad empire. The realization must have been maddening for the old tyrant. The qualities he had mocked in William, caution, attention to detail, quiet persistence, were exactly the qualities needed to manage a complex transportation network. The Commodore didn't need another pirate to raid and pillage. He needed a manager to organize and optimize. He didn't need a conqueror to seize new territory. He needed a custodian to preserve and expand what had already been built. And so, the old patriarch made a decision that would reshape American finance. He summoned his worthless son home. It was not a warm reunion. There were no apologies, no embraces, no admissions of error. The Commodore simply commanded William to sell the farm and move his family to Manhattan. He was bringing him into the fold, not out of love, but out of necessity. He needed a lieutenant, and William had proven himself competent enough to serve. The reconciliation was a transaction, a business deal between a father who needed an heir and a son who had spent 18 years proving his worth in exile. But it carried within it the seeds of a transformation that would ultimately consume them both. William Henry Vanderbilt was no longer the stammering boy who had been banished in disgrace. He was a man who had built something from nothing, who understood his own capabilities, and who possessed the patient, systematic intelligence that his father had never recognized. The Commodore thought he was reclaiming a servant, a useful tool to be deployed as needed. He did not realize he was inviting a master strategist into his boardroom, a man whose quiet competence would ultimately eclipse even his own legendary achievements. By 1864, the farm was generating profits that even the Commodore could not ignore. The old patriarch, now 70 and facing his own mortality, made a decision that would reshape American finance. He summoned his worthless son home. But this reconciliation would come with a price that would ultimately consume them both. Every dynasty reaches a moment of reluctant trust, when the patriarch must test whether his heir is worthy of inheriting the kingdom, or merely competent enough to manage its ruins. The year 1864 arrived like a reckoning for the House of Vanderbilt. The Civil War was grinding toward its bloody conclusion, transforming the American landscape while simultaneously pouring unprecedented wealth into the coffers of those who controlled the arteries of commerce. Railroad stocks soared as armies moved on steel rails, and freight contracts multiplied like golden offspring in the ledgers of transportation magnates. At the center of this industrial hurricane sat Cornelius Vanderbilt, 70 years old and wealthier than most nations, yet confronting an enemy he could not bully into submission: his own mortality. The Commodore was a force of nature contained in human form, a 6-foot titan who had clawed his way from a single ferry boat to an empire worth $100 million through sheer brutality and strategic genius. He was functionally illiterate, yet possessed an almost supernatural gift for understanding leverage, timing, and the precise moment when another man's weakness could be exploited for maximum profit. His face was carved from granite, all sharp angles and cold calculation, with eyes that could reduce grown men to stammering children. He hired and fired without sentiment, threatened competitors with ruin, and delivered on those threats with methodical cruelty. But time, that most democratic of adversaries, was beginning to exact its price. His body, less disciplined than his mind, had begun to betray him with fatigue that no amount of willpower could overcome. The empire required a successor, and the options were a catalogue of disappointment. His younger sons represented various tragic shades of failure, one epileptic and frail, another a dissolute gambler who squandered money as efficiently as his father accumulated it, a third dead from tuberculosis complicated by excess. His daughters were, in his Victorian worldview, simply women, unfit by nature for the masculine arena of railroad competition, where fortunes were won through intimidation and lost through weakness. That left William Henry, the exile who had spent 18 years managing a farm on Staten Island with irritating competence. The Commodore had successfully ignored his eldest son's quiet success for nearly 2 decades. But financial reality has a way of penetrating even the most stubborn denial. Reports from accountants indicated that the farm was not merely surviving, but thriving, generating returns that suggested genuine business acumen rather than mere agricultural luck. This created an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance for Cornelius. Either his initial judgment of William as a blatherskite had been correct, and the farm's success was accidental, or his son possessed capabilities the old man had catastrophically failed to recognize. The solution to this dilemma was characteristically brutal and efficient. Cornelius would design a test so difficult, so laden with obstacles, that only genuine competence could overcome it. If William failed, as the Commodore secretly expected, it would confirm decades of contempt and justify bypassing him entirely when arranging succession. If William merely survived without embarrassing the family name, the damage would be contained to a marginal operation far from the empire's profitable core. This was not an opportunity disguised as charity. It was a probation designed for failure, a final chance for his son to prove that the old man's harsh judgment had been accurate all along. The instrument of this test was the Staten Island Railway, a bankrupt disaster that Cornelius had acquired almost accidentally as part of a larger financial transaction. To call it a business was an act of charitable fiction. The railway was everything a competent businessman would avoid: chronically unprofitable, plagued by mechanical failures, cursed with poor route planning that served neither industrial nor residential needs effectively. Its 13 miles of track wound through marshlands and scattered settlements with no coherent strategy, connecting places nobody particularly wanted to reach. The rolling stock was antiquated, held together by determination and prayer. The stations were crumbling monuments to deferred maintenance, their platforms rotting and their schedules more suggestion than promise. Previous management had abandoned it as unsalvageable. The Commodore's own accountants recommended liquidating the assets and writing off the losses. Instead, in the summer of 1864, Cornelius summoned William to his Manhattan office and handed him the keys to this wreckage. The meeting was brief and characteristically devoid of sentiment or explanation. William was to take control of the Staten Island Railway, apply whatever methods he thought appropriate, and either make it profitable or confirm his own inadequacy. There was no budget for improvements, no promise of support from the broader Vanderbilt network, no safety net if he failed spectacularly. The unspoken message was devastatingly clear: this is your inheritance, ruin disguised as opportunity. Transform it into something valuable, or disappear back to your farm in permanent disgrace. William Henry accepted the assignment without complaint, negotiation, or visible emotion, a response that should have warned his father that something fundamental had changed during those 18 years of exile. The Commodore expected either desperate protests about the impossibility of the task or frantic requests for resources and support. Instead, his son simply nodded, asked a few precise technical questions about existing contracts and debt obligations, and departed to begin work with the quiet intensity of a man who had spent decades waiting to be asked a question he knew how to answer. What followed was a masterclass in systematic transformation that revealed the true genius William Henry Vanderbilt had developed in obscurity. He did not begin with grand pronouncements or dramatic restructuring designed to impress observers. Instead, he started by walking the tracks, all 13 miles of them, personally. In his long coat whipping against the briny coastal winds that rolled in from New York Harbor, he inspected every section of rail with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining a patient. He carried a leather-bound notebook and filled page after page with observations, measurements, and calculations that would have bored his father to fury, but revealed everything about the railway's operational deficiencies. He noted where maintenance had been criminally deferred, where drainage was inadequate and caused track subsidence, where curves were poorly engineered and forced trains to reduce speed unnecessarily. He mapped the locations where mechanical failures occurred most frequently, identifying patterns that previous management had ignored. He studied the marshlands through which the tracks passed, understanding how seasonal flooding affected operations and what modifications could minimize weather-related delays. More revolutionary than his attention to physical infrastructure was his approach to human resources. William met with engineers, conductors, maintenance crews, and station agents, not to issue commands or demonstrate authority, but to ask questions and listen to answers. What were the most common mechanical failure points? Where did delays most frequently occur? And what were their underlying causes? What modifications would yield the greatest operational improvements per dollar invested? These men, accustomed to being treated as interchangeable tools by previous management, found themselves consulted as experts whose knowledge was genuinely valued. Their responses proved invaluable. They knew which bridges needed reinforcement before winter, which stations generated the most passenger complaints and why, which schedules created bottlenecks that cascaded into system-wide delays. They understood the practical realities of operation in ways that no boardroom analysis could capture. William synthesized this information with the systematic thinking he had developed during his agricultural exile, seeing patterns where others saw only chaos, identifying leverage points where small changes could produce disproportionate improvements. The transformation he implemented was not glamorous, but it was devastatingly effective. William realized that the railway's chronic unprofitability stemmed largely from its disconnection from the ferry service to Manhattan. The two transportation systems operated on completely different schedules, leaving passengers stranded at docks and stations, forced to wait unpredictably for connections that might or might not materialize. He synchronized the timetables with obsessive precision, ensuring that every train met every ferry, and every ferry was met by a train. This required detailed analysis of travel times under varying weather conditions, negotiations with ferry operators, and the creation of buffer periods that absorbed minor delays without destroying the entire schedule. He renegotiated fuel contracts, leveraging the Vanderbilt name to secure better coal prices, while implementing inventory controls that eliminated the theft and waste that had been bleeding profits for years. He standardized maintenance procedures, creating schedules that prevented catastrophic equipment failures rather than merely responding to them after they occurred. He replaced incompetent supervisors with men promoted from within the ranks based on demonstrated ability rather than political connections or social class. He renovated stations, not with extravagant marble and gold leaf, but with fresh paint, sturdy benches, and clear signage that communicated to the public that the line was no longer a ruin to be endured, but a service to be relied upon. Most crucially, he addressed the human psychology of the operation. William paid workers on time, a revolutionary concept in an era when wage theft was standard practice among failing enterprises. He created incentive systems that rewarded efficiency, punctuality, and safety, transforming a demoralized workforce into employees who took genuine pride in their operation. The result was not just improved morale, but measurable improvements in performance, reduced absenteeism, fewer accidents, and a level of customer service that began attracting passengers who had previously avoided the line entirely. The mathematical results of these systematic improvements were undeniable. Fuel costs decreased by 12% through better contracts and inventory controls. Maintenance expenses dropped by 18% through preventive scheduling that avoided catastrophic repairs. Most dramatically, passenger revenue increased by 23% as reliability improved, and word spread that the Staten Island Railway was no longer a gamble, but a dependable service. Each percentage point represented hours of analysis, negotiation, and implementation. Unglamorous work that nevertheless produced results that could not be dismissed or explained away. By 1867, 3 years after William assumed control, the bankrupt Staten Island Railway was generating consistent, substantial profits. The transformation was so complete that the Commodore's own accountants initially suspected the ledgers contained calculation errors, failed enterprises, did not simply reverse course through competent management. But audit after audit confirmed the numbers. The railway that was supposed to prove William's incompetence had instead become a testament to his systematic brilliance, a mathematical proof that the qualities his father had mocked as weakness were actually terrifyingly effective business tools in the emerging industrial economy. When the balance sheets reached the Commodore's desk in Manhattan, they created the first crack in the armor of his certainty. For 70 years, Cornelius Vanderbilt had operated on the unshakable conviction that his judgment of character was infallible. That weakness revealed itself immediately to his experienced eye. That his harsh assessment of William as fundamentally inadequate was simply accurate observation. Refined by decades of experience in evaluating men, the Staten Island Railway's resurrection challenged that foundational belief in ways that threatened his entire worldview. The old man's response was characteristically pragmatic rather than sentimental. He did not apologize for decades of contempt or acknowledge his error in exiling a capable son. Instead, he began involving William in broader railroad operations, treating him as a useful resource rather than a disappointing heir finally redeemed. He sought William's analysis of potential acquisitions, his assessment of competitor strategies, his evaluation of operational efficiencies across the expanding Vanderbilt network. The traits that had seemed like fatal weakness, caution, sensitivity to detail, systematic observation, were suddenly recognized as precisely the capabilities needed to manage a railroad empire grown too complex for instinct and intimidation alone. This grudging acknowledgement created a psychological dynamic that would ultimately prove more dangerous than exile had ever been. William Henry, starved for paternal approval for 43 years, found the Commodore's newfound respect intoxicating beyond measure. Every request for his opinion, every consultation on strategic decisions, every indication that his father finally recognized his competence became a validation he had desperately craved since childhood. The boy who had stammered in his father's presence began speaking with quiet confidence in boardroom meetings. The exile who had been dismissed as a blatherskite was now seated at the right hand of American capitalism's most feared patriarch. But this validation came with invisible chains that would ultimately prove more confining than physical exile had ever been. The more essential William became to the empire's operations, the more trapped he was in a system designed by and for a man who had never truly respected him. His father's approval was not unconditional acceptance, but transactional recognition of utility. William was being transformed from a disappointing son into an indispensable tool, valued not for who he was, but for what he could produce. The Commodore needed a manager, an implementer, a systematic mind to organize and optimize what his own aggressive instincts had conquered. He had found that manager in the son he had spent a lifetime despising, but he had not found a successor he was prepared to respect as an equal. The irony was lost on neither man, though neither acknowledged it openly. William had proven himself worthy by succeeding at a task deliberately designed to confirm his unworthiness. The Commodore had tested his son expecting failure and instead discovered competence that surpassed his own in crucial areas of modern business management. The empire that Cornelius had built through force and intimidation was being quietly transformed by patience and systematic analysis, prepared for survival in an industrial age that would demand efficiency over aggression, organization over instinct. In boardroom meetings, the contrast between father and son became increasingly apparent to observers who were witnessing the changing of an era. The Commodore would pound tables, issue ultimatums, and intimidate opponents into submission through the same tactics that had served him for half a century. William would sit quietly, taking detailed notes, asking clarifying questions that revealed strategic options his father's aggression had obscured, and later producing analyses that provided roadmaps for sustainable competitive advantage. Cornelius conquered through force. William consolidated through efficiency. The old man seized territory. The younger man made that territory permanently profitable. The Staten Island Railway had proven everything and changed nothing fundamental in their relationship. It demonstrated that William Henry Vanderbilt possessed capabilities that exceeded even his father's legendary business acumen in the areas that would matter most in the coming decades. It revealed that the qualities mocked as weakness were actually strengths perfectly suited to the emerging corporate landscape of post-Civil War America. It confirmed that the exile had used his 18 years of invisibility to develop a managerial philosophy superior to his father's brutal force in every measurable way. Yet the fundamental psychological dynamic remained unchanged. The Commodore still viewed his son through the lens of decades-old contempt, seeing competence as surprising rather than inherent, treating success as fortunate rather than earned. William still sought approval from a man constitutionally incapable of providing unconditional acceptance, still measured his worth against standards designed to find him wanting, still operated in the shadow of a patriarch who had defined him as inadequate before he could define himself. The success that should have liberated him had instead created a more sophisticated form of captivity. William Henry Vanderbilt was no longer an exile, but he was also not a free man. He was becoming the essential engine of his father's ambitions, the indispensable mechanic of a machine that would eventually grow so large and demanding that it would consume his health, his peace, and ultimately his life in service to an empire that had never been designed to serve him. When the balance sheets from Staten Island reached the Commodore's desk, they revealed something that would change the trajectory of American wealth, not failure, not mediocrity, but methodical brilliance of the highest order. And in that moment, the empire Cornelius thought he controlled entirely began slipping, quietly but inexorably, into more capable hands. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January 1877, his will was not just a document, it was a declaration of war against his own family, with William Henry Vanderbilt as the sole victor. The reading took place in a dark-paneled law office on Lower Broadway, where gaslight flickered across faces frozen in anticipation and dread. The air was suffocating, thick with expensive tobacco smoke and the weight of dynastic expectations about to be shattered. Outside, New York City continued its relentless commercial rhythm, oblivious to the financial earthquake occurring in that mahogany-lined chamber. The Commodore's children had gathered like minor royalty awaiting the division of a kingdom, each nursing private calculations about their share of America's greatest fortune. They came not as equals in affection. Cornelius had never distributed that commodity fairly, but as equals in blood, which they assumed guaranteed them equal portions of his wealth. That assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. The attorney's voice was steady as he recited the legal formalities, but the tension in the room vibrated almost audibly. William Henry sat motionless, hands clasped, his face revealing nothing, while his siblings stole glances that ranged from resentful to hopeful. The numbers, when they finally emerged, fell like artillery shells in the suffocating silence. Of the Commodore's $100 million estate, $95 million, nearly the entirety of American capitalism's greatest accumulation, was bequeathed to William Henry Vanderbilt. The other siblings received what could only be described as insults disguised as bequests. The daughters were granted trust funds of $500,000 each, carefully structured to prevent their husbands from accessing the principal. While substantial by any ordinary measure, these amounts represented barely 0.5% of the total estate. The younger sons fared even worse, receiving bequests so modest they bordered on contemptuous. Cornelius Jeremiah, the epileptic youngest son whose condition the Commodore viewed as evidence of moral weakness, received only the income from a $200,000 trust, enough to survive, but not enough to threaten the family reputation through gambling or dissolution. The will was not merely unequal. It was a final, brutal judgment rendered from beyond the grave. The Commodore had concentrated his wealth with the same ruthless efficiency he had used to build it, declaring in legal prose what he had spent a lifetime muttering in curses. Only one heir possessed the competence, discipline, and strategic vision worthy of controlling an empire. The message was unmistakable and devastating. William alone among his children possessed value, while the others were genetic failures unworthy of meaningful participation in the dynasty's continuation. The family exploded into litigation before the Commodore's body had cooled in its ostentatious mausoleum. Led by his sister Mary Alicia and brother Cornelius Jeremiah, the disinherited siblings filed lawsuits contesting the will on grounds that would become templates for inheritance disputes for generations. They claimed their father had been mentally incompetent in his final years, his judgment clouded by age and the ravages of chronic illness. More damningly, they accused William of undue influence, painting a portrait of a weak-minded patriarch, manipulated by a scheming son who had whispered poison into dying ears. The allegations were as vicious as they were calculated, that William had systematically isolated their father, controlled access to medical care, and exploited the old man's declining faculties to secure an unconscionable advantage. The court battles became public spectacles that captivated the nation, daily theater for a public hungry for gossip about the seemingly untouchable elite. Newspaper reporters swarmed the courthouse, scribbling down every salacious detail as the Vanderbilt name was dragged through the mud of open testimony. Headlines screamed across front pages: "Vanderbilt will contest and family at war over millions, and Commodore's children battle for fortune." The proceedings exposed private letters, medical records, and family quarrels to the voracious appetite of the press, transforming the inheritance into serialized entertainment that revealed the dysfunction festering beneath America's most successful dynasty. Most devastating of all, William's own mental capacity was questioned in open court, his character dissected by opposing counsel, who sought to prove that the blatherskite of Staten Island had evolved into a Machiavellian manipulator. Witnesses testified that he had always been weak and easily influenced, suggesting that his apparent competence was merely the result of cunning advisors exploiting his father's declining judgment. The irony was bitter and profound. For years, William had fought desperately to prove his worth to his father. Now he was forced to defend his integrity to the world, while his own flesh and blood attempted to destroy him in pursuit of money that had never truly belonged to them. William's psychology during this escalation revealed a fundamental difference from his father's temperament. Unlike the Commodore, who had thrived on conflict and viewed lawsuits as competitive sport, William took no pleasure in the warfare. He was a man who valued order, privacy, and systematic efficiency, and the public brawling mortified him on levels that transcended mere embarrassment. He approached the litigation not as a battle to be won through superior aggression, but as a mess to be cleaned up through methodical negotiation. With characteristic pragmatism, he moved to settle the lawsuits, agreeing to pay his siblings substantial additional sums, enough to buy their silence and end the public spectacle that was damaging both his reputation and the railroad's stock prices. The settlements were generous by any objective measure, yet they represented a tiny fraction of his inheritance, strategic calculations designed to restore stability rather than expressions of familial affection. The victory, when it finally came, felt hollow and pyrrhic. William emerged as the undisputed master of American railroads, controlling a network that stretched from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. Yet he felt perpetually embattled, constantly suspicious of enemies who might emerge from any quarter. The lawsuits had revealed something disturbing about his position. Wealth on this scale created adversaries by its mere existence. His siblings had resented him not for anything he had done, but simply for what he possessed. The broader public, reading about his $95 million inheritance while they struggled to earn $2 a day, viewed him with a mixture of fascination and hatred that would only intensify as his fortune grew. With the legal distractions finally resolved, William channeled his mounting anxiety into the only therapy he understood: relentless, consuming work. From 1877 to 1885, his business activities escalated into something approaching pathological obsession. He was driven by a terrified need to prove that the $95 million had not been a mistake, that his father's posthumous confidence had been justified by results that no critic could dispute. The ghost of the Commodore still haunted every boardroom, and William worked 18-hour days in a desperate attempt to appease a spirit that would never be satisfied. His private study at 640 Fifth Avenue became a command center that resembled nothing so much as a military headquarters during wartime. Maps of the rail network covered every wall, marked with his careful annotations showing traffic patterns, competitor routes, and expansion opportunities. His desk groaned under the weight of financial reports and correspondence that arrived by the hour from dozens of divisions across his empire. Telegraph operators worked in shifts to ensure he remained connected to his system at all times, their instruments clicking constantly with updates on freight tonnages, passenger loads, equipment failures, and competitor activities. The room was simultaneously a sanctuary and a prison, a place where William exercised absolute control over an empire while becoming increasingly isolated from everything beyond its mechanical demands. The expansion he pursued was methodical and ruthless in its efficiency. William understood that the future of American commerce lay in the connection between Atlantic ports and the industrial heartland of the Great Lakes, and he moved to consolidate that corridor under unified control. He absorbed the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway, securing a vital direct connection to Chicago that eliminated competitors and maximized operational efficiency. He acquired the Canada Southern Railway, creating alternative routes that bypassed potential choke points controlled by rivals. He negotiated coordination agreements with Western lines, enabling freight to move seamlessly across thousands of miles under management systems that prioritized efficiency over territorial rivalry. Every acquisition was calculated with breathtaking precision, designed not merely to expand his network, but to create sustainable competitive advantages that could not be easily replicated. William did not buy railroads for glory or ego gratification. He purchased them to construct a seamless, integrated machine that generated profits with mathematical certainty. Under his stewardship, the New York Central system became the global standard for railroad efficiency. He doubled track capacity, laid heavier steel rails to support larger locomotives, and introduced the block signal system that prevented collisions while enabling higher speeds and greater freight density. Yet this expansion became compulsive, driven less by strategic opportunity than by psychological necessity. William could not stop acquiring, consolidating, and optimizing because he had become addicted to the validation that successful deals provided. Each percentage point improvement in operational efficiency, each competitor eliminated, each $1 million added to the bottom line represented temporary proof that he was worthy of the burden he carried. The work consumed him completely. He ignored his doctor's increasingly urgent warnings about his deteriorating health, dismissed his family's concerns about his absence from their lives, and transformed his existence into a relentless pursuit of numerical perfection that could never be permanently achieved. The physical toll was severe and visible to everyone except William himself. His blood pressure rose to dangerous levels, manifesting in a persistent flush across his cheeks and a tremor in his hands that became more pronounced during stressful negotiations. His weight fluctuated as his appetite became subordinated to his work schedule, and chronic insomnia left him pacing the halls of his mansion at night, his mind racing with freight tonnages and bond yields that would not permit rest. His mansion, theoretically a palace of comfort and luxury, became merely another extension of his office, filled with art he purchased but never truly observed, and furniture that served primarily as surfaces for additional paperwork. The mathematical achievement of these 8 years defies easy comprehension. When William inherited the Commodore's fortune in 1877, it was estimated at $95 million. By 1885, through systematic expansion and operational improvements, he had nearly doubled it to approximately $200 million. In contemporary terms, this would be equivalent to transforming a fortune of $100 billion into $200 billion within a single decade, accomplished without the aid of modern technology, global financial markets, or speculative bubbles. It remains the most successful instance of wealth accumulation by an heir in American history, a testament to strategic vision and managerial competence that his father's generation could never have imagined. But the tragedy lay in the complete absence of satisfaction or joy in this unprecedented achievement. The doubling of his inheritance brought William no sense of triumph, only a grim recognition of duty fulfilled under impossible circumstances. The money did not purchase freedom. It generated mounting pressure and profound isolation that increased in direct proportion to his wealth. He felt constantly suspicious of government interference, anticipating that politicians would attempt to break up his monopoly through regulatory action. He sensed the rising tide of public resentment, the hatred of working classes who viewed him as a parasite fattened on their labor. Every newspaper editorial was a potential attack, every dinner party a possible trap, every business meeting an opportunity for betrayal or manipulation. William had become the financial axis around which significant portions of the American economy revolved. Yet, he experienced this centrality as a target painted on his back, rather than a crown upon his head. He trusted almost no one, retreating further into the sanctuary of his work, the only environment where rules were clear, outcomes were measurable, and success could be quantified in ledgers that did not lie or betray. The litigation had severed many of his family relationships, the compulsive work had ruined his health, and the accumulated wealth had alienated him from a society that viewed his success as evidence of their exploitation. He was the richest man in the world, yet arguably the poorest in terms of peace, contentment, or human connection. He had transformed himself into a machine, an extension of the locomotives he commanded, driving forward relentlessly because he no longer remembered how to stop or what stopping might accomplish. The world saw a titan of commerce, a king whose empire stretched across a continent, but the mirror reflected a tired, sick man who was still desperately trying to earn a nod of approval from a ghost who had never learned to give it. He had doubled his father's empire and become the financial axis of an entire nation. But success, for William Henry Vanderbilt, felt suspiciously like a trap, and one afternoon, in a moment of exhausted honesty, he would reveal exactly how much he had come to despise the world his wealth was supposed to serve. We return now to that railroad car, to that question, to those 4 words that would transform 8 years of financial genius into a single moment of public damnation. The luxury carriage cuts through the Hudson Valley darkness on October 8, 1882, carrying its exhausted sovereign toward a catastrophe he cannot yet perceive. The mahogany paneling gleams in the amber glow of gas lamps that flicker with each curve of the track, casting dancing shadows across leather-bound ledgers stacked on side tables like monuments to obsessive documentation. Crystal decanters catch the lamplight and throw fractured rainbows across the ceiling, beautiful yet useless ornaments in a space designed for relentless work rather than pleasure. In the corner, telegraph equipment clicks softly but persistently, a mechanical heartbeat that never stops, connecting William Henry Vanderbilt to an empire that demands constant vigilance and permits no rest. The air is suffocating, thick with cigar smoke that hangs in ghostly layers, and the weight of accumulated stress that has become William's permanent atmosphere. Outside the frost-covered windows, his railroad network stretches across the American landscape like a vast nervous system, steel veins carrying the lifeblood of commerce through valleys and across plains. Millions of passengers ride his rails at this very moment, ordinary Americans trusting their lives and fortunes to his system, completely unaware that their richest citizen is about to declare them irrelevant with a candor that will destroy him. William sits behind his enormous desk, and the toll of 8 years is carved into his features with brutal precision. His face is fleshy and tired, jowled with chronic stress, flushed with the unhealthy sheen of dangerously elevated blood pressure. His hair has surrendered large territories to iron gray, and deep grooves bracket his mouth like parentheses around a lifetime of suppressed resentment. His waistcoat strains when he exhales, and his left hand trembles, not from fear but from neurological exhaustion, the physical manifestation of managing an enterprise so vast that its demands never cease. He is 61 years old, but appears 70, aged by responsibility and the relentless pursuit of validation that can never be permanently secured. The day has been particularly brutal, even by William's punishing standards. He has spent hours reviewing reports about unprofitable branch lines, those lonely threads of track that wander into rural communities, connecting small towns to his vast network at a consistent loss. These routes bleed his system, draining resources that could be deployed productively elsewhere, yet closing them would leave entire communities isolated from the broader economy. The reports sit on his desk now, marked with his careful annotations, mathematical evidence of the impossible position he occupies between economic rationality and social obligation. To William, they represent the central paradox of his existence. The public insists that railroads are public servants, but treats their owners as criminal aristocrats when they attempt to cover their costs. Across from him sits the reporter from the Chicago Daily News, perched on the edge of a plush seat, with the awkward bearing of someone who knows he does not belong in such surroundings. His suit is modest, nearly threadbare at the cuffs, but his notebook is pristine, pages filled with careful annotations from their hour-long conversation. He represents a new breed of American predator, the muckraker armed not with weapons, but with persistence and the devastating power of the printed word. For the past hour, their conversation has followed predictable patterns of questions and measured responses about railway expansion, consolidation, and the future of American commerce. William has answered with his usual economy, but beneath the rehearsed responses, fatigue is visible and growing. The reporter, emboldened by the monotony and sensing an opportunity to extract something more inflammatory than statistics, leans forward with a question that appears almost innocent. Do you run your trains for the benefit of the public? The words are not accusatory, but to William, already raw from reviewing the hemorrhaging branch lines, they feel like an insult wrapped in naivety. He hears not curiosity, but the familiar, ignorant assumption that railroads are charitable institutions obligated to serve everyone at any cost, while their owners are condemned for trying to produce returns for investors. The question strikes at the fundamental dishonesty William perceives in public discourse about railroads, the expectation that private enterprises should operate as charitable institutions, sacrificing profitability to serve communities that cannot support the service they demand. It represents everything that exhausts him. The naivety of people who do not understand that railroads require capital and maintenance to survive. The moral grandstanding of politicians who demand services they refuse to subsidize. The hypocrisy of a public that wants the benefits of private enterprise without accepting its economic logic. Time suspends in the heavy air of the carriage. Behind William's heavy-lidded eyes, exhaustion collides with irritation, and the carefully maintained barrier between thought and speech begins to crack. He is not a politician trained in diplomatic evasion or a public relations expert skilled in managing perception. He is a man who has worked himself toward an early grave trying to prove his worth through measurable achievement, and he is tired of pretense. Tired of criticism from people who do not understand the mathematics of transportation. Tired of being expected to apologize for competence. The words emerge not from malice, but from bone-deep fatigue and brutal honesty. The public be damned. I'm working for my stockholders. The effect is instantaneous and devastating. The reporter's pencil stops moving mid-stroke, creating a silence that feels heavier than the smoke hanging in the air. The scratching sound that has provided counterpoint to the train's rhythm suddenly ceases, and in that crystal moment, the only sounds are the relentless clacking of wheels beneath them and the distant whistle of another train passing in the darkness. The young man's eyes widen, not with moral horror, but with professional recognition. 4 words: sharp, quotable, incendiary. They are lightning captured in a bottle, a headline that will write itself, a scandal that will sell newspapers for weeks. William continues, explaining what he means with characteristic precision. He cannot be expected to sacrifice the railroad's financial health to please a public that does not understand transportation economics. Railroads are not charities, but businesses with stockholders who invested capital and deserve returns. His duty is to those investors, to the system's long-term viability, not to the sentimental wishes of communities that want service but refuse to pay sustainable rates. His language is clinical, mathematical, duty, capital, risk, return. Words that make perfect sense in boardrooms and sound like betrayal everywhere else. He does not realize that these distinctions will not survive the journey from private car to public page. Nuance does not travel as quickly as outrage. Context will be stripped away like bark from a tree, leaving only the raw, inflammatory core. By morning, telegraph wires will carry his sentence across states and time zones with ruthless efficiency, but they will carry only the 4 words, divorced from explanation or qualification. The aftermath unfolds with terrible viral speed that demonstrates the power of modern communication to amplify scandal. By dawn, telegraph operators across the continent are tapping out his words, sending them racing along copper wires at the speed of electricity. By mid-morning, newspaper editors are holding emergency meetings, recognizing immediately that they have been handed a perfect story, a quote so apparently arrogant that it requires no embellishment. By afternoon, the first editions hit the streets with headlines screaming across front pages. The public be damned, and Vanderbilt's contempt for the people and richest man declares war on America. The quote is stripped of all context and presented as a declaration of aristocratic contempt for the common citizen. Editorial writers, seeking opportunities to attack railroad monopolies, seize upon William's words as confirmation of everything they have suspected about the moral rot of concentrated wealth. They do not mention the unprofitable routes he was discussing or the stockholder obligations he was explaining. They present only the 4 words, stark and damning, as if they represented his entire philosophy. Editorial cartoonists create images that will define William in the public imagination for generations, depicting him as a bloated robber baron with an enormous belly stuffed with gold coins, while skeletal workers are crushed beneath locomotive wheels. Preachers thunder from pulpits about wealth's moral corruption. Labor unions find their rallying cry, organizing strikes and demonstrations with signs quoting William's phrase. Politicians seeking populist credentials denounce him in speeches that echo coast to coast. Letters arrive at his Fifth Avenue mansion by the thousands. Death threats, kidnapping plans, promises to burn his depots and derail his trains. His mansion requires armed guards at every entrance. His children need escorts in public. The richest man in America becomes a prisoner of his own wealth, surrounded by priceless art he has no time to appreciate, protected by men with guns against a nation that wants him dead. The ultimate irony crystallizes with crushing force. The man now painted as a monster had spent 8 years doing precisely the opposite of what the caricatures suggest. He had not inherited a perfect machine and idled while it printed money. He had systematically doubled America's greatest fortune through methodical brilliance, revolutionizing railroad efficiency and working 18-hour days to prove his worth. Yet none of this competence matters now. William Henry Vanderbilt becomes a public villain, not for cruelty or incompetence, but for stating an uncomfortable economic truth that no one wanted to hear. The catastrophe was not that he had lied. It was that he had told a truth too raw, too honest for a society that prefers its economic realities softened into euphemism. The public's hatred was immediate and absolute. But William Henry Vanderbilt would discover that their contempt was not the worst consequence of his honesty. The worst was what it did to his body, and the clock that had already begun counting down to his final, inevitable surrender. December 8th, 1885. In a mansion filled with priceless art he had purchased but never truly seen, William Henry Vanderbilt discovered that the richest man in the world could not buy himself another heartbeat. The house at 640 Fifth Avenue stood like a stone verdict against the winter sky, its triple brownstone facade rising from the snow-covered street like a monument to accumulated wealth. Inside, the silence was heavy and expensive, insulated from the commercial chaos of Manhattan by thick walls and layers of velvet drapery. Snow drifted silently past tall windows framed in crimson silk, settling on ledges and cornices with a delicacy that mocked the brutal machinery of fortune contained within those walls. The mansion was a temple to acquisition without appreciation, its galleries lined with masterpieces that represented millions of dollars yet remained essentially invisible to their owner. Rembrandts hung in gilded frames, their chiaroscuro depths capturing human emotion with brushstrokes that William had no time to contemplate. Bouguereau's classical figures gazed down with serene beauty that went unnoticed, purchased not for aesthetic pleasure, but because men of his wealth were expected to collect such things. Marble sculptures from European masters occupied pedestals in corners, their forms perfect and cold, reduced to line items in an inventory rather than objects of beauty. He had spent years accumulating this museum of culture, shipping masterpieces across oceans, insuring them for staggering sums, yet he had never truly looked at any of them. They were assets, proof of taste and power, decorations for a life that had no room for leisure or contemplation. In his private study, William sat surrounded by this fortune in frozen culture, but his attention remained focused on the ledger before him, columns of figures representing freight tonnages, bond yields, operational expenses. The room had become less a sanctuary than a fortified command center, its walls covered with maps of the New York Central System, showing an empire of steel stretching from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. Shelves sagged under leather-bound ledgers and financial treatises. His desk was buried beneath correspondence, bond circulars, and reports that arrived by the hour, creating a paper landscape of perpetual obligation. His breathing was labored, each inhalation requiring conscious effort, as if his lungs had forgotten their automatic function. The simple act of drawing air had become work, another task to be managed in a life where everything required management. His left hand trembled as he set down his pen, the tremor more pronounced than usual, sending a line of ink skittering across the page and ruining the mathematical precision he had maintained for decades. For a moment, a rare, unguarded moment, his eyes drifted from the numbers to a small painting by Meissonier hanging on the adjacent wall. He had purchased it in Paris through an agent at extraordinary cost. Yet as he looked at it now, he realized with crushing clarity that he could not describe its subject from memory. To him, it had been merely a line item: acquisition price, insurance valuation, potential appreciation. At 4:12 p.m., as the winter light thinned into dusk, the inevitability that his physicians had predicted finally arrived. It came not as cinematic drama, but as sudden, catastrophic betrayal. A searing pain ripped through his head, so sharp and total that it obliterated thought. The blood vessel in his brain, overworked, overstressed, stretched beyond endurance by years of chronic hypertension, burst with devastating force. A massive cerebral hemorrhage flooded the delicate architecture of his mind, drowning neural circuits that had once calculated the movements of a continent's commerce with terrifying precision. William let out a strangled sound, half gasp, half groan, one hand flying to his temple as his body lurched sideways. The chair absorbed the impact, then tilted enough to send him sliding toward the floor. The unfinished ledger slipped after him, pages fluttering like a wounded bird, its careful calculations scattering across expensive carpet. Ink spilled from the overturned inkwell, spreading slowly across the desk in a dark pool that crept over numbers and notes, obscuring them in a black tide that seemed to symbolize the end of a lifetime's meticulous record-keeping. Servants heard the fall and rushed through corridors designed to amplify importance, their footsteps thundering against marble floors. They found their master collapsed, his breathing shallow and irregular, his face flushed an alarming shade of purple. Urgent telegraphs summoned the city's finest physicians, men who arrived breathless with their leather bags, filled with instruments and remedies that were utterly inadequate against the catastrophe unfolding within William's skull. They attempted interventions that were more ritual than remedy: bleeding, compresses, whispered consultations about apoplexy and ruptured vessels, but the damage from years of unrelenting pressure had finally claimed its price. At 6 p.m., in the heart of a mansion built by his wealth and maintained by his will, William Henry Vanderbilt died. He was 64 years old, younger than his father had lived to be, killed not by rivals or financial panic, but by the empire he had doubled through systematic brilliance. The irony was complete and devastating. He had spent his entire life proving he was not weak, not foolish, not unworthy of his father's name, and in doing so, he had worked himself to death, sacrificing rest, peace, and any semblance of moderation on the altar of competence. The boy who had once been dismissed as a blatherskite with weak lungs had become the most powerful businessman in America, and that transformation had quite literally burst a blood vessel in his brain. The immediate consequences of his death unfolded with the same mathematical precision that had characterized his life. William's will distributed approximately $200 million among his 8 children, with characteristic attention to detail and strategic thinking. Cornelius II, the eldest son, received $67 million and control of the New York Central Railroad, inheriting not just wealth, but the responsibility of managing the empire's core asset. William K., the second son with social ambitions his father never shared, received $65 million and effective freedom to pursue the aristocratic lifestyle he craved. The daughters received substantial trust funds, carefully structured to protect them from fortune hunters, a progressive gesture in an era when women's wealth was typically controlled by their husbands. On paper, it should have been the foundation of an eternal dynasty, a fortune so vast that even modest investment returns would preserve it across generations. The $200 million, properly managed, could have generated annual income sufficient to maintain the family's position without ever touching the principal. But William's death removed the one force that had held the family's acquisitive instincts in check: his own systematic discipline and understanding that wealth must be actively maintained, not passively enjoyed. Instead, the inheritance became a curse disguised as a blessing. Within one generation, the Vanderbilt children transformed the fortune from a tool of industry into an instrument of competition, a race to outbuild, outspend, and outdisplay each other in a spectacle of consumption that the world had never seen. They were not interested in the boring, unglamorous work of railroad management, the maintenance schedules, freight contracts, and operational efficiencies that generated their wealth. They were interested in extravagance, in social conquest, in proving their aristocratic credentials through architectural monuments. They embarked on a construction spree that rivaled the building programs of European monarchs. Cornelius II erected the Breakers in Newport, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo that stood as a monument to excess on the Rhode Island cliffs. William K.'s wife Alva constructed Marble House, a temple of white stone that cost $11 million to build, $7 million of which was spent on marble alone. George Washington Vanderbilt II built the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, a 250-room French chateau that remains the largest private residence in America. These were not homes, but stage sets for social performance, requiring armies of servants and oceans of cash to maintain. While the masonry rose, the foundation crumbled. The railroads, the engines that generated the cash flow to support this madness, were neglected, their management delegated to hired professionals who lacked the family's vested interest in long-term survival. The systematic efficiency that William had killed himself to establish began to deteriorate. Roots were ignored, technological innovations were missed, and competitive advantages eroded. The family began selling shares of the New York Central to finance their yachts, their balls, their European tours, and their divorces, treating the principal like income and cannibalizing the source of their wealth to buy more symbols of their status. The mathematical tragedy of this decline defies easy comprehension. By 1947, when 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion, not a single one of them qualified as wealthy by the standards their grandfather had established. The $200 million fortune, equivalent to over $5 billion in contemporary terms, had vanished in 70 years, dissipated through a combination of extravagant spending, poor management, and the simple mathematics of dividing wealth among increasing numbers of heirs. The dynasty that was supposed to last forever was gone in 3 generations, a cautionary tale about the difference between building wealth and preserving it. The secondary characters in William's story continued their lives largely unaware of the roles they had played in this tragedy. The reporter from the Chicago Daily News, who had asked the fatal question 3 years earlier, continued his career in journalism, likely unaware that he had helped destroy the most competent financier of his generation with a single question. He remained what one might call an accidental assassin of reputation, a footnote in the history of American journalism remembered only for extracting 4 words that would define an era's perception of wealth and power. The railroad workers who had struck against William's policies eventually won better working conditions and higher wages, but under different corporate ownership as the Vanderbilt grip on the system loosened and failed. The public that had demanded his blood and reveled in his damnation achieved a kind of victory. The robber baron was humbled in memory, his fortune dissipated, his heirs transformed into caricatures of frivolous socialites rather than feared industrialists. Yet their revenge carried a quiet cost they never calculated. In destroying the prestige of systematic competence, they also lost the disciplined efficiency that had made their transportation system the world's most advanced. As the snow continued to fall on that December evening in 1885, covering the city in a blanket that muffled the noise of commerce, the body of William Henry Vanderbilt lay in state among the masterpieces he had collected but never truly seen. He had died as he lived, quietly, efficiently, and largely misunderstood. The public saw the fortune but not the fear, the empire but not the exhaustion, the arrogance but not the lifelong hunger for approval that no amount of money could satisfy. His children saw the inheritance but not the burden, the privilege but not the price at which it had been purchased. The mansion at 640 Fifth Avenue would continue operating for decades, maintained first by his widow and then by his descendants, but eventually it too would become unsustainable. In 1927, just 42 years after William's death, the palace would be demolished to make way for a department store, a commercial enterprise replacing a residential monument in a transformation that would have struck William as grimly appropriate. The art collection would be sold at auction in 1945, the masterpieces finally appreciated by people who had time to look at them. But the true legacy of William Henry Vanderbilt would not be measured in dollars accumulated or mansions built. It would be found in the silence of that study, in the unfinished ledger, and in a question that haunts every great fortune and every driven life. What happens when proving your worth becomes more important than preserving your soul? In the end, history remembers the Commodore who built the empire and the grandchildren who spent it. But William Henry Vanderbilt, the man who doubled America's greatest fortune, has been largely forgotten. Perhaps that is the cruelest irony of all. Walk down Fifth Avenue today between 51st and 52nd Streets, and you will find no trace of the triple brownstone palace that once dominated the block like a stone declaration of permanence. Where William Henry Vanderbilt's fortress mansion stood, that sanctuary of American capital with its mahogany-paneled rooms and priceless art collection, office buildings now rise with the indifferent efficiency of modern commerce. Department stores occupy spaces where ballrooms once glittered with European chandeliers. The physical monuments to his wealth have been demolished with shocking thoroughness, their marble sold for scrap, their bronze doors melted down, their very foundations buried beneath subsequent construction. The city he helped build has cannibalized his memory, paving over his achievements with the relentless indifference that only a metropolis can muster. In the Metropolitan Museum of Art, tucked into a gallery of forgotten American magnates, a single portrait preserves his image for posterity. The painting shows him in his late 50s, dressed in formal black, his jowled face revealing the accumulated weight of responsibility and chronic stress. His eyes gaze out with an expression that might be determination or exhaustion. The canvas cannot distinguish between the two. Visitors walk past without stopping, their attention drawn to more dramatic figures elsewhere in the museum. The plaque beside his portrait reads with brutal economy, William Henry Vanderbilt, 1821-1885. Railroad magnate. No mention of the doubled fortune, the revolutionary management systems, the systematic brilliance that transformed American transportation. Just a name, 2 dates, and a generic description that could apply to dozens of forgotten tycoons. Yet William Henry Vanderbilt's life embodies a fundamental paradox that transcends his specific circumstances and speaks to the universal tragedy of wealth pursued for the wrong reasons. He was the man his father called an idiot, dismissed as a blatherskite unworthy of inheriting an empire, yet he possessed strategic brilliance that surpassed even the Commodore's legendary instincts. Where his father conquered through force and intimidation, William conquered through systematic efficiency and patient observation. He was mocked as weak, his asthma and bookish nature treated as evidence of fundamental inadequacy, yet he built an empire more efficient and profitable than any competitor could match. He was hated by the public, transformed into a symbol of Gilded Age arrogance by 4 words spoken in exhaustion, yet his management methods became the foundation of modern corporate efficiency that every railroad would eventually adopt. But none of it was enough. Not the doubled fortune, not the revolutionary efficiency, not the mathematical proof of his superiority to the father who had dismissed him. Because William Henry Vanderbilt was never truly trying to build a fortune, he was trying to silence a voice that had haunted him since childhood, the voice that whispered he would never measure up to his father's expectations, that he was fundamentally inadequate, that his existence was a disappointment to the dynasty he represented. Every ledger entry was an argument, every acquisition a plea, every efficiency gained an appeal to a ghost who never listened. This is the universal truth about dynasties and damaged children that wealth cannot obscure. No amount of money can fill the void left by parental contempt. No empire, regardless of its size or profitability, can silence the doubt planted in childhood by a father who viewed affection as weakness and approval as something to be perpetually withheld. And no man, regardless of brilliance, discipline, or strategic vision, can outrun the need for validation from someone who is already dead, who took his harsh judgment to the grave and left his son arguing a case before a jury that had already been dismissed. The mathematical precision of William's failure makes it all the more tragic. When he inherited his father's fortune in 1877, it totaled approximately $95 million. By his death in 1885, through systematic expansion and operational improvements, he had transformed it into nearly $200 million. This represented one of the most successful instances of wealth accumulation by an heir in American history, accomplished not through speculation or luck, but through disciplined management that eliminated waste while maximizing efficiency. By any objective measure, he was the most competent businessman of his generation. Yet he could never double his own sense of worth. That internal ledger remained forever unbalanced, showing a deficit that no amount of external success could eliminate. He accumulated wealth he would never spend, the art collection he never truly appreciated, the mansion he experienced only as an office, the fortune that brought him no pleasure beyond temporary validation. He built a legacy his children would squander within 2 generations, transforming systematic discipline into frivolous consumption. He proved himself to a father who had already passed judgment and would never revise his assessment, working himself to death at 64 in pursuit of approval that had been permanently withheld. The speed with which his monumental effort was undone defies comprehension. His children, raised in the velvet cage of Fifth Avenue luxury, had not shared his trauma or learned his discipline. To them, the railroad was not a machine requiring constant maintenance, but a magic tap that poured money into their accounts. They engaged in competitive extravagance, building mansions that rivaled European palaces, the Breakers, Marble House, Biltmore Estate, while neglecting the source of their wealth. They treated the principal as income, selling shares of the New York Central to finance yachts, divorces, and social ambitions. By 1947, when 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion, not a single one qualified as wealthy by the standards their grandfather had established. The $200 million fortune had vanished in 70 years, dissipated through a combination of extravagant spending and the simple mathematics of dividing wealth among increasing numbers of heirs. The Vanderbilt fortune is gone now, dissolved into the dust of Fifth Avenue. The mansions are museums or rubble, their treasures scattered to auction houses. The railroads operate under different corporate names, their connection to the Vanderbilt dynasty reduced to historical footnotes. But the lesson remains, carved into the invisible marble of demolished palaces and floating in the commercial air of modern Manhattan, that the greatest fortunes often exact the highest price, not in money, but in the human souls that create them. William's portrait hangs in that museum gallery, largely ignored by visitors seeking more dramatic narratives. But his story deserves attention precisely because it reveals the quiet tragedy of a man who possessed extraordinary capabilities, yet deployed them in service of an impossible goal. He was not trying to build wealth for luxury or power for its own sake. He was screaming across the divide of death, desperately seeking validation from a ghost who would never answer. The mathematics of his soul remained stubbornly in deficit while his financial empire soared to unprecedented heights. In the gilded mathematics of wealth and power, William Henry Vanderbilt should be remembered as one of the most successful businessmen in American history. Instead, he occupies the middle ground of memory, neither dramatic enough to fascinate nor villainous enough to captivate. Perhaps this forgetting is itself a form of tragedy, that a man who spent his entire life trying to be remembered as worthy has instead been erased by time's indifference to quiet achievement. William Henry Vanderbilt doubled America's greatest fortune, revolutionized an industry, and died the richest man in the world. But he could never purchase the one thing he truly wanted: his father's respect. And that, perhaps, is the most expensive failure of all, a reminder that in the gilded mathematics of wealth and power, some equations can never be solved.